So, speaking of dictatorial regimes, let's talk a little bit about what life was like for the correspondents who were in Russia, in the pre-war period and in World War II. I mean, much of the book is about their plight. For those who haven't read the book yet, tell them, please, what did these correspondents have to go through?
Well, um, uh, people who follow Russia in the 1930s will know the name of Walter Duranty, who got his Pulitzer Prize for his writing. He was a very fluent writer, a Brit actually from Liverpool, but he always knew what Stalin wanted to read, and to a certain extent what Roosevelt wanted to read too. And he triangulated between these and pleased them, and of course uh, denied the Ukrainian famine, said it was all got up by the British. It was a sort of typical British anti-communist thing. Anyway, but it got harder and harder towards the end of the 30s because Stalin had had enough of foreign reporters, and by 1940, of course, Russia hadn't joined the war then. By 1940, um, his successor had decided that it wasn't worth staying. His successor was another Brit called Eric Geddy, and he cabled to New York that there is no news value in being Moscow at all, and uh, anyone who works there basically knows that they're wasting their time. He cabled that to New York, and then he closed down the bureau. Of course, that seemed the right thing to do, but within a year, of course, Stalin and Roosevelt were going to be allies, so I don't think he was ever forgiven for that. So um, uh, in 1941, because of the lack of journalists, Russia was still a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside a riddle, or the other way around. So there was a huge appetite in the States, in Britain, public appetite to know what made Russia tick. Was Stalin a good guy, a bad guy? Was he a blood-soaked dictator? Was he going to save Europe? All that kind of thing. So some of the best war correspondents in Britain, of course, there was nowhere left on the European continent that hadn't been swallowed up by the Nazi war machine. So they fought each other to get there. The Russians limited the numbers. They wanted, thought 24 was about the limit that they could cope with at the time. And as they made their way there, they began to realize quite quickly that it was not going to be a tea party. They were told in no uncertain terms by God, what's his name? The Stalin's favorite. I
I
can't
mean,
remember his name.
they're the
Ehrenberg, Ilya Ehrenberg. I've forgotten his quote. They were told by Ilya Ehrenberg, who was Stalin's favorite war correspondent, that they should forget their Western ethics when they came to Moscow. And he said, all objective correspondents in a wartime should be shot. Obviously, they weren't going to be shot because they were allies, but it was made clear that they were going to be part of the Kremlin propaganda output, whether they liked it or not.
so they can't. It's like they're living basically in a giant Potemkin village where they're barely allowed out. When they are allowed out, everything is choreographed around them,
Yeah,
and then their copy has to go through censors.
yeah, and the censors sometimes they even rewrote the stuff so it would fit in with the Kremlin line, and any attempt to add some color to some copy would be excised. For example, one reporter spoke to a Soviet soldier and said, "Well, how's it going?" And the soldier said, "Hitler kaput," and he put that in his copy. But the censor said, "Oh no, you can't write that." He said, "Why not?" "Well, we understand that Hitler's still alive." So, so it was extremely rigorous, but also mindless. The censorship. They couldn't travel outside Moscow. I mean, they could go to the Bolshoi every night of the week if they wanted to. They could go to the theaters. Um, if they could afford it, they could go to a restaurant. But they had very generous rations, even as much vodka and caviar as they wanted, while the rest of Russia was practically on starvation rations. Um, so they lived relatively well. They were mostly extremely grumpy, drank too much, and I suppose thought, well, one day we will get to Berlin. We will be first to the ruins of Berlin. After Stalingrad, when the fighting had stopped, they'd tore the place. There was some good copy there, but they had to wait a very long time for anything, and they were always escorted.
So before we turn it over to Paul and Patty, I also want to make sure we get to the unsung heroes of this book, which are the secretary translators. And those
Yes.
of us who, arrived in Moscow, maybe not speaking very good Russian, know that feeling of being dependent on, usually a wonderful person with great journalistic instincts. Who were these translators, and what happened to them? What pressures
Well,
were they under?
uh, well, they had to report to a KGB minder. Actually, the organization was called the NKVD at the time. Every week, they had to say what the reporter was talking about, what type of person they are, if they'd met anyone, had they been anywhere, had they said anything interesting. So they did that. I mean, some of them said, I have said, even said it to the reporters that this was the drill. But where did they come from? There weren't a huge number of people fluent in English. Obviously, Nadia, who had been to New York, was there. But Tanya, my friend in Tunis, she was not as loyal to Stalin as she might have appeared. But because she spoke good English, learned from American oil men from Tennessee, I think in Grozny, she was hired. Um, Probably if the KGB had been looked more closely, they would realize that she was a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Sovieteer and just wanted to get out, which she did. There was another interesting one who told everyone in the Metropole that she had been sentenced to the Gulag in Kazakhstan for a number of years, but she wrote, she'd had a letter writing campaign, and she'd had her sentence reduced. But actually, the truth, and I found this out from Memorial, is that it wasn't as a result of her letter writing campaign that she was released early. She had to spend 2 years in the Lubyanka, in the prison, as a stool pigeon with other women, foreigners, because she was a good speaker. And as a result of that, she was allowed out early. So, but that wasn't known to, she was a very jolly person, and no one realized that that's how she got out of jail early. So they kept, well, you know what it's like, what was like in the Soviet Union or after the Soviet Union, when Soviet citizens were dealing with foreigners. They liked to not have any other Soviet citizens with them, so that things couldn't be reported back to them, basically. So usually, and if someone was more confident, then that was a bit suspicious. That would suggest that they were well in with the secret police. And indeed, Ralph Parker, the Times man, who I keep referring to, his translator, whom he married, was generally assumed to be a colonel in the KGB. I don't think she was, but she was very effective anyway.
Thanks so much, Alan. We'll be back. And here's the Red Hotel, and we will pass it over to Paul and Patty. Thanks so much.